Okay, so we have a fabulous video offering for the Vinifera Practical Magic Permaculture group. And what I've decided to do after my first attempt to get everybody on the Zoom call is I'm looking for people who are willing to share their personal story as emotional support during this crisis. And the first person that I actually asked was my friend John. And I've been wanting to do a video with John for a long time, mostly because he is a wise philosopher, and then I'm going to add fool, because he does something on social media that causes enough actual introspection and critical thinking, and he kind of flips the script on things, and he causes people to really think outside of the container, the box. And when I've watched him through the years, I felt like there is a strong masculine presence who can point out something that maybe we've all been complicit with, but really flip that over and ask some questions about that. The other thing that inspires me about John, and he has a practice of Tantra. So if you've watched my videos before, I like to go into the deep, dark places, like the negative emotions, like what's in the shadow there. And as I understand it, one of the definitions of Tantra is to be able to hold the opposites, to be able to hold like the dark, shadowy part and also the light and bright part. And at some point I might interview John about what Tantra is, because I feel like as a planet, we're all going to have to now invite like the darker part that we've not been willing to address before and flip those scripts and see really what's under there. And then the other thing about John is that he has actually been at my house. He spent time in my gardens. He watched my children grow up. So he's like an authentic witness also to who I am and how I raised my children and how my garden grows, basically. And then what I want to ask John is kind of like, how does he find inspiration to grow things? And he has a homestead himself that he grows, and he built his house much with his own hands. So he's like a man with a will, you know, like he wants to do something with his physical body, which I find with my clients, there's like this hesitance to like pick up the shovel and move the manure. You know, there's this hesitance to put seeds in the compost and see what comes out. So what I'm going to call this video today is Just Be Curious, because John and I don't have credentials, you know, as herbalists, but we've both studied quite a bit. And we don't have credentials in science or medicine. In fact, one of the things that I love about John is that he's a musician. So he's kind of like a Renaissance man to me, where he can do a little bit of everything. He's a really creative thinker. He's a musician. He can play anything. His voice is amazing. And he's also like a real partner to his partner, whom I also love tremendously. And I have a relationship with both of them, where he's a man who is a committed partner. So everything about John is something that I want to like explore for the Practical Magic Permaculture group and the Vinifera Vine of Life, that we're offering you all emotional support. So, and listen to the way John speaks. John, I also feel, is like a deeply embodied human, where he really lets the soul reside inside of his physical flesh. So notice those kind of things. And I know this is a vast introduction to John, but those are the things that I know about John, and I really wanted to bring to the group so that you could all be inspired. So the first thing I'm going to ask you, John, is where do you live and why do you live there?
Good question. Thanks for the introduction, Lalita. It's great to be with you. We live in Bear Lake, Michigan. We live outside of town on a rural homestead. We have 40 acres here. That was pretty depleted farmland. And actually, I'm seeing a family of young deer just moving through the forest and playing right now as we speak. Um, we have a flock of birds, some ducks, guinea hens, and chickens that are squawking outside right now. And it's kind of a long story how we ended up here, but I had some family connections through my grandfather who actually used to come up to this area from Chicago as a youngster in the 1930s while he was studying music. Um, so that is an epic story in itself, how our family ended up coming back year after year following my grandpa's time here almost 100 years ago now. But to fast forward to when Karen and I ended up deciding to move here, we had been living in a hermitage in India for off and on almost 6 years. During that time, we were renting an apartment outside of town in the Himalayas, living in a community with, our spiritual master and a group of his disciples. And due to some health issues I was having, and some family attachments that we were dealing with our, our people back here in the United States, and also some kind of upheaval that was happening in our community in India. In 2011, we decided to come back and settle down in the US. And that was a really difficult decision for a lot of reasons. And, we've continued to sort of have to come to terms with that over the years, especially ending up now in this situation that we're all in during this pandemic lockdown. But when it ended up happening is we were interested in moving away from the city. We had both grown up in and outside of Chicago. And when we came back, we were living with my in-laws under the same roof with my wife's parents. And at that time in our marriage and our practice, it wasn't easy to be a part of. It wasn't easy to come back from this intense, deeply introspective, slow spiritual lifestyle in India and jump right back into the Chicago, consumerist rat race kind of mentality. So we wanted to escape the city. And we had looked at property in Vermont. We had done a series of real estate, explorations, and just, we didn't quite find our niche, and we didn't quite find a place that also matched our budget for where we could settle down and essentially start a new life. We had lived in Vermont before, but we didn't really have roots there. So that didn't end up working out. We had spent some time in French Canada years ago when I was studying music up there, and we looked around a little, seeing if we might like to settle down in French Canada, but the issue was even more pronounced that we just didn't have a strong enough connection to the place to feel like we could really get settled. And so when the time came when we were back in Chicago and we needed to find an alternative to staying there in our hometown. And I remember I had been getting more and more interested and sort of dependent on medical marijuana for a variety of ailments, health issues that I was having. And I read in the paper that Michigan had passed a medical marijuana referendum. So I said to Karen, hey, maybe we should look in Michigan. and it's just next door to Illinois where we grew up. So, okay, yeah, let's check it out. And so we started driving up here on weekends and ended up gravitating towards this little section of rural Northwest Michigan in the Lower Peninsula where my grandfather had come as a child and where my mom grew up coming in the summers. And for, I would say, almost a year, we were coming up, spending long weekends, looking around, checking out communities, camping, crashing with friends. And we ended up finding this little one-room schoolhouse from the 1880s that had been moved into the middle of this farm field and attached to this super basic, kind of crudely thrown together off-grid electrical system. And the place was in shambles. It was like practically just completely dilapidated, but we saw something, we saw some potential in it, and we ended up buying this place on foreclosure at a really cheap price, and there you go. So that was a big adventure in itself, and now we're proceeding with that adventure in the ongoing renovation of this place as we try to make it into a home for ourselves.
Yeah, John. So that's the story I wanted people to hear is many of my clients were thinking about relocating this year and leaving cities, and how could they do it? They didn't know that they had the physical skills to go out on a piece of land and buy like a dilapidated place and fix it up. And I encourage them, just if you're in a city, and particularly this year with the crisis, and you feel like really restrained, some of my clients like left Los Angeles and drove to Tennessee, a story very similar to yours. And then they got a dilapidated place in Tennessee. So I'm thinking of a woman who's like a very urbanite woman, my age. Same thing, they got this ramshackle place in Tennessee, but there were strawberries everywhere. And she was like, it was like covered with wild strawberries and the smell of wild strawberries. And we just knew. And they had been camping with their dog here and there, like crossing the country and seeing where they could feel into like this would be a place that they could set up a homestead. And that is somebody who's like a like very urban person. And for the first time this year, she planted some things like little bits of seeds in her urban dwelling in California, and saw she could grow something. So there was like hope behind that. And other clients of mine have made that shift, and you've made that shift. The other thing I heard you say is that you were drawn to a place where you could grow herbs that would help you. And I think that's really important too. And part of the story that I want you to bring out is I interviewed John just a little bit before we got on, and we talked yesterday about, how did he manage to like begin a farm, like a homestead? And it's going to be like, what are you interested in growing? So I tell some of my clients who want to like grow mushrooms, what is it that you want to grow? And start with what it is that you want to grow, like 3 varieties of mushrooms, and just do that mushrooms. And then you start to learn like how to do other things, because that medicine that you want to grow is like flourishing. And then it moves on to other things. So John, can you tell us a little bit about kind of the inspiration that you received from cannabis?
Definitely. Now, I'll have to restrain myself because there's a temptation to get into a 10,000 year epic history here. And the human body has actually co-evolved with the cannabis plant in the form of the endocannabinoid system for at least 4 million years, probably much longer, I would imagine. But understand that connection to the plants it's built into our DNA, literally. Um, some people have more receptors than others, but I definitely feel that personally my connection to the cannabis plant is just beyond this lifetime of this individual person, John. But I would also like to add that I think that farming and tending the land can also very much be a part of our ancestral DNA. And I have a good reason for saying that, which is over the years, as I've gotten more interested and developed my skills in farming and learned about cultivating the cannabis plant, but also I have an interest in tobacco. And that came in the context of my experience. It was more of just a hobby that blossomed into a real intense curiosity about the culture of tobacco. And I'm pointing that out because recently, just in the last couple of years, I found through some of my relatives, my aunts, research into our ancestry that my fifth great grandfather, who happens to share a name, who I share a name with, not on purpose because I was named after my father's father, but um, this person named John Storms, um, which is my name basically, was a tobacco farmer in Kentucky in the 1860s. He was actually the foreman, the farm manager, or the head laborer at a tobacco farm, and actually married the plantation owner. I shouldn't use the word plantation because that implies connection to the southern economy that I don't have any reason to suspect was part of that. But the tobacco farm, the owner of that, um, his daughter married my ancestor, so that would make her my ancestor also, which is an important thing to realize how focused we are in this culture on the patrilineal aspect, that people jump to, oh, well, your male ancestor was a tobacco farmer. But what about his wife's father was a tobacco farmer, and she was just as much my ancestor as her husband was. But that was in Kentucky, and according to my research, Kentucky was also one of the major hubs of hemp production throughout the 19th century and into the 20th century, and they're also having a renaissance now with the new farm bill in place that allows hemp production to continue at this stage. So most farms in Kentucky were probably growing hemp at that time. The cash crop of my ancestors' farm was tobacco. And here I am in 2021 now, sorry, growing cannabis and tobacco myself. So that's something that is somehow a part of me, even though I didn't consciously know it. And you can see some of my tobacco collections in the jars up there. I have different years of different heirloom strains of tobacco that I roll up and cure and save. And then I present those as special gifts to different people, like Native American elders and people who come to visit me who appreciate those kinds of offerings. So I know I got off track a little bit on your initial question, Lalita, but I just wanted to talk about how we might not consciously know that we have a connection to the land and to agriculture and to growing things, but in fact, most of us do.
Mm.
Because almost everyone is descended from someone who grew their own food at some point in previous generations. So when it comes to me on a personal level, you know, cannabis basically, I would say cannabis saved my life for all practical purposes. Um, Growing up, I had a lot of health issues that were chronic, but not always acute. And so it really wasn't until my teenage years that I even started to try to address them through any sort of medical treatment. And so what those include was, um, well, let me just start by saying that I was born in 1980 and was heavily vaccinated from my early childhood, from my infancy, in fact, if I am correct in understanding my medical records. But I was getting jabbed with injections throughout my childhood. And, my parents trusted the doctors and medical establishment that the treatment I was receiving was appropriate. And so I don't blame them for not questioning it. But looking back, I do realize that I suffered chronic illness. My immunity was very weak throughout my childhood. I would get like frequent bad fevers, frequent strep throat infections. When I would contract the flu or a cold, I'd be sick for days, if not weeks. And throughout those years, I had chronic fatigue. I was telling you, Lalita, in a previous conversation, how I used to fall asleep in school almost to the point of like narcolepsy. And not to say that I have that condition, but like to point out that it was really severe and it shouldn't be normal for a child to have those kinds of issues where you can't even stay awake during the day. And I also, to this day, suffer from chronic pain from scoliosis, where in my thoracic spine there's a twist. And I remember that from my early childhood, that pain associated with sitting, especially. And by the time I was in high school, I was training to be a concert pianist, but I wasn't able to pursue my love of playing piano music because I couldn't sit and practice. Because in on any given day, 20 minutes into a practice session, sitting at the piano, my back would have such intense pain that I would literally have to lie on the floor. So I was never able to really practice, to put in the hours needed to achieve that level of proficiency on my instrument. And that ended up actually moving me to focus more on singing and using my voice as an instrument, which was a great platform for exploring my inner spiritual life. And I'm kind of glad that I didn't end up being a piano player at that high echelon, though I have continued up until I lost all my music gigs in 2020. I continued to work as a professional piano player, just not as a concert pianist. But it was in college where I was suffering insomnia, because chronic fatigue can often lead to insomnia. Like it seems contradictory, but they go hand in hand. So I'm suffering from insomnia, awful chronic pain in my spine, anxiety, really weak immunity. And I discovered cannabis, and it changed my life because suddenly I could smoke a joint and sleep through the night. It helped symptoms of respiratory problems that I had, chronic respiratory allergies. And it helped relax my back so that I could be comfortable. And so, I started getting interested just kind of secretly in a way, because I was sort of straight edge and goody two shoes in my outer social personality. So I had this secret interest in the cannabis counterculture. And when Karen and I finally ended up going to India to study yoga and meditation on a real serious level, I was like, it was a huge revelation for me. I felt like I had come home not only to a place that I could call as a spiritual home, but also coming home culturally, because we joined a lineage where cannabis is used as a sacrament. Um, and without going into too much detail about our practice and the rituals surrounding our use of cannabis, that was very affirming for me, because I came to a place where a community was saying, yes, you can use this medicine and it can enhance and support your spiritual life. You don't have to hide it. You don't have to um, keep it a secret in your home. You don't have to um, pretend that you are maintaining this purity while you're secretly using this drug. So going to India and being immersed in that culture is what finally gave me the um, sort of like power in myself to wipe away the stigma. And so when we got back, I felt like I was ready to really start growing and develop my sort of combine my interest in gardening that I had been developing over the years with my interest in the cannabis plant and all of its healing properties, and ended up making that like a kind of business for myself, which started out as a side hustle to my music and my music education, but has ended up now becoming more of my focus, as our musical profession has been so severely restricted by these economic lockdown measures that I no longer can depend on any sort of professional income from my music. So I am now in the process of building up my business so that I can expand what I'm doing in terms of cannabis and hemp and making medicines, and just doing whatever I can within the legal framework to make that the focus of my profession now.
Yeah. John, do you mind if I kind of sum up a whole bunch of fabulous topics that you were pointing out?
Please go ahead.
Yeah, so yesterday I posted in Practical Magic Permaculture a conversation with Robert Kennedy and Zach Bush. And one of the things that Zach said at some point was that we don't need to like collapse the government or even get the Environmental Protection Agency to change its policies towards Monsanto and glyphosates. What we really actually need to do is all of us just bypass that whole system and go out and do farming. And he said that, he and his entire research team presented something like 29 different documents to the EPA this year to show that glyphosates were really poisoning the soil, and that there was another way to regenerate the land very quickly and to make money. And what he found was that all of those scientific journals were completely dismissed by the EPA because they were not written in regulatory language, meaning they weren't in legal language, they were in scientific language. So the way that Zach was saying that we should do this is everyone, like John, should stop depending on the system out there, because it really seems like there is a crisis lockdown that will continue no matter what. And we really want to just like buy the seeds and get ready. get ready to farm and create your own sustainable economy. Now, as John said, we all have relatives. 100 years ago, there was not one being on this planet who did not know how to farm. 100 years ago, everybody was growing something. And in fact, stores were not really available. So just 100 years ago, there was the same crisis that we have now. There were no stores available, and you had to grow your food and you had to know how to store your food. And everyone had their particular cash crop that they would trade. In fact, there's a lot of place in Appalachia where there are still women, particularly from the older generation, who don't do cash. They literally go to town and trade their beans. And I watched a documentary of 3 different 90-year-old women, an African-American woman, a Cherokee woman, and a Scotch-Irish woman from Appalachia. And every one of them described their childhood. This was just 90 years ago, had no cash at all, had no electricity, did not, was not part of the system, and most of them did not have cars, and they grew all of their own food. So this is like totally within our DNA, which is what John was saying. Like we are hardwired to know how to grow food. It's really basic. And then John also pointed out that much of the economy in the early United States was hemp. And this is like, people don't even know this. It was tobacco and hemp, and also cotton. In the North, we also had sheep. Here where I live in Vermont, there were sheep all over the hills. But it became a taboo. And I did post something from the Flexner report that was written in 1910, that all of these wonderful cash crops became illegal because they were readily available. So then people like John D. Rockefeller, who was an oil baron, could not make money on your hemp. So hemp has a long history, like John was saying, with our DNA, like to be interactive with this highly medicinal plant. And I have a medical marijuana card, and I also grow my own and make my own balms and tinctures, and I have a lot of edibles, and I also have a lot of just smokables upstairs, but I don't smoke. I mostly put it on my body. I just like rub it right in with shea butter, which helps my joints and my inflammatory response to my exposure of glyphosates through my father in Vietnam. So I rub it, Claude rubs it right into my feet because I grow a lot of weird osteophytes because I have glyphosate exposure from Vietnam. And then John also spoke about something that Robert Kennedy and Zach Bush spoke about, that 50%, fully 50% of children have chronic disease now. And John explained in his childhood that he had chronic fatigue, he had illnesses, low immunity, he had respiratory illnesses. He just didn't have a stamina to stay awake and vibrant. And yet he is such an awake and vibrant soul with so much creativity. And a lot of boys, particularly now, in school, have to be on a whole bunch of other pharmaceuticals. And that pharmaceutical just compounds like the inflammatory response within the body, that child is taking a substance that is like highly taken from the actual plant body that would give all the information to the body. And for instance, Adderall is crystal meth. So instead of just taking cocaine straight up, they're taking all of this bits out and making the body highly addicted to crystal meth so that the child can't function without it. So what John's talking about is he's really talking about our ancient history of full plant medicine that we evolved with. And I wonder, John, where do you want to go with this? Do you want to show your other tinctures and kind of talk about what you're working with right now?
Sure. I'm going to start with what's closest at hand at the moment. Now, this is a tincture that I made myself using vodka distilled from potatoes. And all I did was grow the herb which I'll talk about in just a second. But I grew the herb, I harvested it, I stuffed it in a jar, and I poured vodka over it, and I waited. So this is Sweet Annie tincture. And Sweet Annie is a plant in the Artemisia family. It grows similar to wormwood and mugwort. It has a similar leaf shape and flower pattern like those plants do, and that distinctive Artemisia aromatic, that strong aromatic smell. And I actually grew Sweet Annie because way back, almost a year ago, when the virus first came out of Wuhan, China, and I was reading about the approach that people in China, that the Chinese doctors and herbalists were taking, using traditional Chinese medicine to treat this novel coronavirus. One of the things they mentioned is that Artemisias, in particular, this species, Sweet Annie, and I'm sorry, I don't remember the Latin nomenclature at the moment, but anyone can look it up and identify the plant for themselves. The English common name is Sweet Annie, and it was determined that Sweet Annie contains compounds that are similar in their effect to hydroxychloroquine, in that the compounds in the plant actually fight the virus by disabling its ability to reproduce in our cells. So I was like, great, I have a flower garden, I have a medicinal herb garden, I'm going to grow some Sweet Annie. And, honestly, I neglected the plants. I didn't even remember they were there for a big part of the season. And then I went out in the early fall and I found them, and they were kind of like scraggly little things because they didn't get much attention, but they were going into flower, and I figured, why not? I'm just going to pick what I have. And so I gathered this clump. I mean, it was no more than just a couple handfuls of this plant, and I brought it in the house, and I stuffed it in this jar, and I poured vodka over it. And you know what? It's wonderful stuff. Even just smelling it, and you get this really strong, invigorating, like you might be able to see my eyes are wider now. I'm smelling the Sweet Annie tincture, and it's like just so good. And I'll tell you, when I come home, when I go out, and I don't know about other places, but in Michigan, we're forced to wear masks if we go into any indoor public space. And that's a whole nother debate over to what extent we should use our power of civil disobedience when we may not feel comfortable with certain edicts and mandates. But in most cases, if I'm running in the store, it's easier for me to just keep a low profile, wear the mask, not bother anyone, and come out of there. But after a long day in town doing my shopping and things, I don't feel well, and my throat is kind of hurting from wearing this cloth diaper on my face. And I'll take a dropper full of this stuff, and it's like it changes my whole world. And it also, the strong aroma in medicinal plants is equally part of their medicinal action. And this stuff actually helps my anxiety because I know I can feel it's killing anything that I might have like picked up in my throat and my nose. So I love this stuff, and I recommend it. In high doses, it could potentially be harmful, but A little goes a long way, and it's great. I also have this chaga mushroom tincture that actually my friend presented to me. And this stuff I just received as like a New Year's gift from him. And this stuff is also amazing. The chaga mushroom has a rich, like, it's almost like a chocolatey kind of smell to it. And that's extremely invigorating to take just a few drops under the tongue. I have this ashwagandha tincture, which is a very powerful, what do they call those?
Adaptogen.
Adaptogen. Thank you. That's the word I was looking for. I was at our co-op in the spring, and they had their little plant sale with the, different plants that the local farms were selling outside the co-op under the canopy. And I just grabbed this ashwagandha plant. It cost me like $4. And I put it in a pot in our little greenhouse on the side of our shed. And I just, I watered it all summer and just, basically ignored it. And I was able to harvest enough roots to make this jar of tincture, and you can see the beautiful color. The smell is glorious. It's just like the smell from a store-bought ashwagandha tincture that you would get, and I would say it's probably stronger and better quality because I made it myself from a freshly harvested root. And I collected thousands of seeds from that one plant that I can now plant and have my own entire plot of ashwagandha if I want to this year. So, people should also realize that from a very small investment of your time, energy, or money that it takes to acquire a plant or some seeds, with just a little bit of care and attention, you can multiply that and end up having a crop year after year that you can utilize for your own health and wellness. I have here, this is Osha root tincture, which I didn't grow, and but a friend presented me a bag of Osha root that she had purchased out west. Last year she was on a trip out in the desert, and she visited a Native American craft store in New Mexico, and they were selling bags of Osha root that they had collected. This is known as bear root, and it's wonderful for any kind of respiratory ailment. And you can literally take one drop of this under your tongue once a day, or if you feel some kind of respiratory, like an allergy or asthma symptoms, anything coming on. And this is another one that is extremely powerful. And when I was very, very sick with a flu virus last February, which may or may not have been COVID-19, I don't know, but last winter I got sicker than I've been in probably 15 years. And what finally brought me over the precipice of feeling deathly ill was I started smoking Osha root. I mixed a little bit of this Osha root with some cannabis and immediately started to feel better. And then I'll show you a couple other things. This is a tincture I'm getting ready to strain. I call this papaver tincture. I use the Latin because let's just say that it's prohibited to extract the medicinal milk of this plant, but we're allowed to grow papaver as bread seed. So I call them my bread seed flowers, and I harvest the flowering tops and I make a tincture out of them. And then this can be very, very effective as a natural analgesic, pain reliever, and for using it in those like acute instances where you really need like an emergency pain relief kind of medicine. So that would be as an alternative for using the pharmaceutical opiates, right? That have so many harmful effects. And then finally, this is another one. This is a cannabis tincture that I'm getting ready to strain. And this is actually a year old. So what I do is at the end of every year's harvest, I take the leftovers from the previous harvest that haven't been used, and I pack them all into jars, and I make more medicine out of that. So like now we had a really abundant and high quality harvest in 2020, and we're going through and processing all of those herbs, to get those out to the patients and to make products with in the coming year. So what I'm going to do is probably today I'm going to strain this last year's tincture and set it aside and have that ready to go, and then I'll start collecting the leftover herbs from the previous harvests and get those into jars and then make tinctures of those. So then you keep a cycle going. You're basically making enough to replace what you're using up. And it becomes like the Chinese tradition of the 100-year eggs, where you pickle every year. You take a new clay pot, you fill it with your eggs, you pickle them, place the pot and bury it underground, and then leave it for 99 years. Meanwhile, each year you go to the beginning of the line and dig up the 99-year-old pot of eggs, and you eat those for that year as your 100-year eggs.
I, probably, I feel like a number of my viewers are going to be amazed to meet the Renaissance man. Because I make gardening videos of what's going on in my yard, and people can't believe it. And when I used to have workshops here, or the farm to school children here and teachers here, and the NOFA conferences here about my root cellar, I had a documentary person come, and she said, no one will believe this. Like, no one will believe how you live and that everything in your whole yard is edible. So I can't even make the documentary. But they ended up making the documentary about the little school in town, the Woodstock Elementary School, where we had converted their entire school lunch program to local farm food. And we made sure that those farmers had a place to sell their food, because the elementary school contracted with the farmers, set up a salad bar. I and Claude did the taste tests every week to make sure the children knew how real food tasted. And it's almost like people won't believe this, that you actually exist. I mean, the thing is that I'm trying to show our viewers that we can do it. Like, we can get off of the system out there of indoctrination, that our cash has to come from that, and that even if we go to a cashless society, which a lot of people are afraid of, this cashless society in which you're like given coupons for the company store and can only get your food at the company store, and we're all basically in labor camps working to get our food at the company store. I mean, there's a lot of fear around that, and there's a lot of conspiracy videos around that's coming, that we're in some kind of lockdown to transition us to a fascist society like that. But for me, I'm like, stop making the conspiracy videos and start growing your food. I mean, just start getting a crop. Like, This year, Claude and I are going to invest in 100 new asparagus roots. 100 new asparagus roots, which is a perennial food, which just is going to be in the ground, and it's a beautiful fern. If we don't pick it, it's just a lovely fern in the yard and provides habitat for the bees and the butterflies and the creatures that crawl. And what John is showing you is something exceptional. I mean, I don't know how people can even relate to how exceptional this is, John, that you're like making medicine that they would otherwise be going to the doctor for, like tramadol is an opiate that I was prescribed by my doctor for my pain in my bones. She prescribed me tramadol, which is an opiate. And I immediately had terrible reaction to it, and you know was like vomiting, because it was this highly I don't know how to explain what the pharmaceutical thing is. They like take the active ingredient and they only give you that. They don't give you the whole plant. So then your body doesn't really know, through its cellular memory of growing these plants for hundreds of thousands of years, it doesn't know how to take this thing. And it also then becomes very addictive. Whereas what John is showing you is that you can grow these plants in your yard and make a tincture with, I use 100 proof vodka. You've had some of my tinctures and meads and things before. And they grow like weeds. Like John was talking about his Artemisia plant. It literally is just a weed, like mugwort, you know, and it will grow, and you can save the seeds and you can make the tincture, and your whole yard looks like a weedy mess. I mean, my yard from Google Earth, if you ever Google Earth my yard, it looks like a weedy mess. All of the food, whether it's the ashwagandha, like the strength of 100 horses is what ashwagandha is. And really, mostly my body doesn't even need to take in those things, because I'm also living this like environment with them where that plant is in my yard. And so my body is super strong. Like I have tons of chaga because it grows on the birch trees here. And Claude and I will drink chaga a little bit just because we want to like honor the chaga. We're actually having a spiritual relationship with the plant. Not that we need to consume it, but we're having a spiritual relationship with the chaga by honoring it through a ceremony of drinking it. But I find that I don't need to drink chaga that often because my body is so strong. It's just like I'm honoring these plants by having a relationship with them. And I think that John has this like a spiritual practice, which he alluded to before. And I know because I've sat with John in Sweat Lodge and other ceremony, where it's a ceremony to be in relationship with the plant. And that is a lot of what we're missing when we just go to the doctor and get a pharmaceutical. We're missing the growing of that plant, the harvesting of the plant. Sometimes I would do my harvesting and my major tinctures on an equinox, so doing it on like a really potent day also to make that herb. So part of what John is describing, and I want our viewers to realize, is that it's not like he's sick and he just needs to like, you know, get himself ready to be well, even though he used the bear root to get well from the flu or whatever respiratory illness that he had last year, which was quite severe. I remember that. But there's also the relationship that we're missing when we just depend on some kind of medical intervention. And it's in that relationship that I feel that's what makes us human. You know, like we're here to have a terrestrial relationship with planet Earth, with Mother Earth, with nature. Can you speak to that, John? Like, whenever I've been with you, you've like everything that you take, just seeing you smell those jars, there's like a spiritual relationship with that.
Well, you know, in Western culture, in modern Western culture, I should say, we've become so disconnected from that relationship with the earth that in general, many of us have lost our sense of grounding. So I'll tell you a quick story to give some context to what that grounding really means. When we first came to India, when we first went to visit India and start studying with our guru, he was also relatively new to Western culture. He hadn't spent that much time with Americans, Europeans, other Western people. So he was still getting to know our habits and our lingo, our way of talking, our way of being. And he would hear people like us say things like, oh, she needs to get grounded. And he told us that at first he thought that was odd. He thought this phrase, getting grounded, was odd because in India, in traditional Indian social culture, to call someone grounded was somewhat derogatory because it implied that they were gross. They were a purely physical person, a person who was not very spiritually developed because they were just grounded. So it sounded queer to him until he started recognizing that, in fact, Westerners had lost our groundedness so much. We become so cerebral, but at the same time polarized in our lower chakras due to the influences of of our pop culture and material culture that focuses so much on the lowest common denominator. And what happens is that, like, when people get excited in their lower chakras and that feeds their negativity, then that energy is what ends up traveling up to the brain, and then we get so heady and airy that we're no longer just connected to the basic grounded reality of being human on planet Earth, which should be, like I said, basic. That should be the ground. Our groundedness should be our ground. It should be our spiritual foundation. But in the West, we basically lost our spiritual foundation. So for Baba, that's the name we call our guru, for him, it was a kind of revolution of understanding to see that before the Western mind could be raised up in transcendence, it first had to be grounded. So he started teaching an ancient meditation that he renewed called the grounding meditation. And that's become a practice that now Karen, my wife, has begun teaching on Zoom in a weekly meditation class that she's offering free of charge so that people who are interested in meditation but don't have any experience can start out with a basic practice that can help them just get into their sensation, feel their body, feel your connection to earth, literally establish that energetic connection to the earth before going off into some, advanced philosophy. It's like, take away all this new agey bullshit that, and excuse my language, but it's bullshit in the sense that if we have all of these cosmic ideas about, what spiritual life means, but we're not even rooted in what life means, then what's the point of exploring spirituality? So, I didn't say that as eloquently as I might have. I want to really make sure to keep it inspirational. I want people to feel like that they have a chance to explore these ideas. But I just think it's really important to reiterate what you were saying, that that connection to the earth should be the beginning.
Yeah. So John, so let's go back to something that I remember from Baba. Um, I do believe that Sakim Baba, and you can, I can't really say Baba's full name, but anyways, he did ask you to go and set up a homestead, so that his instruction, that I understood at the time, was that you wouldn't be like missing out on spiritual life to be a householder with a farm. And what I'm finding is that in the modern new age, there is this removal from like the goodness of being a regular human in a real relationship that has all its like need to like explore one another and what our needs are and who you are. I mean, it seems like what Baba was also providing was that you would be doing spiritual life by being a married man with a farm. It wasn't like you needed to become supernatural and go quantum and get into this new age positivity thing. What I think Baba was really telling you was go and be fully involved in being on earth. And then that was the foundation for transcendence. And transcendence to me is a word that my clients may associate with the new age, that I'm just not going to grow plants. I'm not going to be in a relationship. I'm going to stay in my head, and therefore I will have transcended the 3D world. So the new age thing is like, we don't like the third dimension. I mean, there's a lot of language out there about like, we're going to be fifth dimensional. And I think that that is totally what you're talking about. Is Baba has said, be a man who works the land. And that is a spiritual practice. That is awakening. Go ahead and tell me about that.
Yeah, well, when I talk about my relationship with my guru and the instructions he's given me, and how he's guided me in life, it's full of paradoxes. And that goes back to what you were referencing earlier about Tantra. Tantra really, as a practice, as a tradition, is all about managing the paradox. And there's the paradox with a capital T, which is essentially the particle and the wave, consciousness. But there's also all of the paradoxes lower on the pyramid that come into play in our daily existence that we have to manage and deal with. And one of those is renunciation versus attachment, right? And so I think that's the main thing that I am exploring and learning and dealing with in my life as a homesteader and a yogi. Because there's a long tradition of homesteader yogis throughout the Yogacara tradition. And in fact, when I first met Baba, he had encouraged me in that direction. But I will say that when we were getting ready to leave India, Baba asked me to stay because he wanted me to continue my training and my studies. And it was very much for me. Now, he hadn't seen the movie, but it was so much an Empire Strikes Back moment. If there's any Star Wars fans listening, when Yoda helped him lift the X-Wing out of the swamp, and he and R2-D2 fixed it up. And he put on his spacesuit and he was walking over to the ship, and Yoda said, "Don't go. You're not finished with your training." Yeah, I'm actually getting choked up remembering this. Funny. George Lucas. Um, Yoda said, "Don't go. You're not finished with your training." And Luke said, "But my friends need me." And Yoda said, "But if you go now, you'll never, you'll never, basically." Luke didn't realize it in the moment, but he wasn't going to see Yoda again. But, well, he ended up going back and actually seeing him. So I was wrong about that. But the point being is that I had that same experience where the master's telling me, "Wait, you're not finished." And I was feeling pulled by my attachments to go back and do this. So he let me go with the blessing that I could find my fulfillment on this path. But I was going to have to suffer on my own and go through those challenges and obstacles on my own. Whereas if I had stayed with Baba, he, through situations, would have given me the experience in his protective bubble to go through some of that suffering. So, I mean, it was really a matter of a choice. Do I want to go and extend my suffering on my own and learn that way, or do I want to stay and intensify it and have, you know, have it condensed in a shorter time and learn that way? And it was a tough decision for me, and I even to this day often question it, but I made the decision that I did, and now I own it, and I feel that I've come to a place where um, I'm at peace with that, and I'm able to continue my training in the context that it is now. It's just that I also have a pile of invoices and bills and bank statements and you know um, small machinery to maintain, and all that kind of stuff, where I could be sitting on my ass meditating and smoking weed in India.
That was a stellar description, and we felt your emotion of um, the Yoda saying you're not finished yet, don't go. But I can tell you, John, from being your friend, that whenever you came back from India, in the brief times that you and I and Karen were together, I remember particularly Karen saying, "I'm so glad you're on the planet." She would say to me, I feel very emotional because Karen's not with us in this conversation, but like I needed my friends. Like I needed you and Karen, who had this like level of realization, I suppose, that we had to be able to sit together and be really glad that you were here, that I had you. So this is why I wanted to interview John, because he's part of my emotional support on being on planet Earth right now. And you can see that I have like a very similar experience with the gardening and my philosophies that John has. And I don't think that he's really aware of the level of the tantric gift that he is. But I want to point out a little bit that we shared yesterday. John will put something on social media And let's go back many years, like we were talking about yesterday. Many years ago, he listed some scientific journals, studies about infant mortality due to those early shots. I have to be somewhat careful about what I say right now because I don't want to be taken down and have our video dismissed.
Well, I just want to clarify that the study in question that we discussed was specifically looking at um, inflammatory immune response and brain swelling connected with that inflammatory response due to the injections. And I think actually that even the study looked even at pregnant mothers who had received those, immune interventions or whatever you want to call it, VAX, and then when they gave birth, examining how a number of those children were showing that inflammatory immune response due to their mothers having been injected during pregnancy. Mm-hmm. If I remember correctly, but yeah. Please go on with your story.
And I do, and so I'm glad John's clarifying the language of that. And I also remember some studies that you had shared, and maybe I'm making this up, but that was about like how healthy children are in the United States is not being shown clearly, because the United States has a very high level of unhealthy children, despite having like one of the alleged best medical systems in the world. That I think I'm totally making this up, not an expert, but that we're like classed way low in terms of children's health. And yet we have like 76 different injections that a child will receive to allegedly keep them safe and healthy. Now, when John posted that, persons who actually have science backgrounds would really like react to him posting like totally statistical evidence from scientific journals. And yet there was a massive like throwback of like, how dare you question this or that. And what I'm calling this video again is to just be curious, because what I'm wondering about human nature, which I'd like to talk to John about if he has any insight on this, is why does human nature react so strongly, like in fear, against evidence of something that's truly alarming like that? I feel is the lack of Tantra, is the lack of the ability to look at the opposite of what you want to believe and go into those what are called negative emotions and be like, wow, maybe we really have caused injury to our own children. Maybe this injury is being perpetrated by our ignorance and our inability to look at something and flip it over the other way and say, geez, maybe we don't have the best healthcare system. Maybe these 76 required injections are in fact making terrible crisis for our children's health. So there's a thing that I want to get to, like, what is it about human fear that it does not want to look into like the shadowy dark places and just wants to reject it altogether? Do you want to say anything about that?
Yeah, I mean, it's so tricky because in the context of Tantra, we have those polar opposites, but essentially, at least in my practice, the way I understand the spiritual journey that I'm on and that I'm being guided on is that we're trying to balance those. We want to balance the polarity. So let me say, like, when I bring these kinds of questions to my guru, if I take aside. More often than not, he won't respond directly by either supporting the side that I take or by contradicting me. Unless I'm wrong, unless I'm just off base and my factual knowledge is incorrect and he knows, he happens to know better than me, then of course he'll correct me and say, no, 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 it's the other thing. And then in some cases, you know, he'll actually contradict me in order to check my ego. Because in Tantra, while we maintain that groundedness, the object of transcendence is actually to go beyond our personal ego. That's what we're transcending. We're not trying to transcend this life. We're not transcending our flesh. We're not trying to like go somewhere else. We're trying to be right here, but lose the ego, lose the illusion that we're this individual, special, entitled entity who needs to compete with the rest of the world in order to survive. So we're trying to transcend the ego, and I feel like when the issues like you're talking about come up, it's a matter of intellectual ego. It's a matter of when people can't accept information, it's because it doesn't match what they think they know. Like they might have gone to an Ivy League institution and gotten an advanced medical degree, and they spent so much money. They you know they to an extent lowered themselves to a subservient place in order to be indoctrinated by that knowledge that comes from those institutions. To say it better, it's like they invested themselves in this education that tells them one side of the story. So if you say the other side of the story, it's so much of a threat to their personality, their identity of themselves as a student and practitioner of the system, that I think is just very difficult to accept. But see, there's still this polarity there. And when I bring these kinds of topics to my guru, more often than not, especially recently, he neutralizes it. He'll neither support me or contradict me, but rather he'll bring it to a place of just voidness. And that's been a huge, huge teaching for me recently, that I am trying to get to this place in the middle. And I don't mean middle as in centrist politics, where you're sort of acquiescing to both sides by not taking a side, but I mean more of like the transcendent center, where we rise above the binary in whatever topic you might be talking about and come to the core of it. Now, that doesn't mean that the injections are healthy. That doesn't mean that the studies that I shared on social media demonstrating the danger of that is wrong. But when it comes to the argument, when it comes to that debate, you'll see often Buddhist masters, when interviewed about controversial topics, they won't answer directly. And people often chalk that up to, oh, they're just weak and don't want to like stand up against authority. But it's not at all that. It's not at all that. The masters have sovereign authority, but I think in their wisdom and compassion, they're trying to help us get to the middle, the core in ourselves. So, like in regards to the health crisis we're in, and in regards to the like threat of totalitarianism that we're facing, I'm starting to look for that sort of pathway through the middle where I can navigate and stay in the world, but not get like thrown around by it. Not, like I'm keeping my footing, but trying to stay very much as neutral as I can. And that might not be the answer that you were looking for, but when it comes to tantra and spirituality, I think like that it's really needed for people, because a number of the people that I've had negative interactions with on social media or in person regarding these controversial topics like politics, the big pharma, other kinds of like social justice issues. A number of the people that I've argued with have been people who take the left wing liberal standpoint. And I mean, you've probably noticed this. A number of people have come to me recently saying that you wouldn't believe people are calling me a Trump supporter because I'm questioning the lockdown, or because I don't believe in wearing a mask, or because I'm questioning the safety of the vaccines. And now they're saying I'm a Trump supporter. And it's like those people are the farthest thing from right wing that you can imagine. And in fact, they weren't even Trump supporters, like for better or for worse. They just weren't. But they're getting labeled that. Why? Is because if I'm in the center here and I'm trying to maintain some neutrality, and I disagree with someone over here to the left, they're going to see me as right wing because I'm over here to them. They don't see this as the center. They see it as the opposite polarity.
Mm-hmm.
So as long as I'm arguing with them, I'm maintaining that opposition. And I just learned that the hard way over the last 5 years. That like suddenly, like I had people that I had close relationships with calling me alt-right, which is of course ridiculous. But they see it that way. So the solution that I've come to is now I'm exploring, okay, how do I stay in my neutrality and just sort of let this be over here? No, I don't, for some reason, I don't have a problem as much with conservatives. Like, I don't get into these kinds of debates with conservatives somehow. And that's a whole nother discussion to explore of how the political dichotomy is getting sort of shifted and transformed. It's like, it's no longer that simple GOP and Democrat like we were raised with. Like it was so simple back then. You just chose one and ticked a box. I mean, I think it's a lot more complex than that now. And I know we're not even talking about politics, but the point I'm trying to make is how all these issues have become so intertwined that it's very difficult for people who, if they haven't done the research, if they haven't woken up, I mean, they haven't had the trigger in their life yet to bring them out of their box that they're in. So they're always going to see me as over here. So the thing I need to do is get strong in my core, get strong in this middle path standpoint so that people feel comfortable inching closer away from their extreme views rather than feeling more polarized by seeing me as having extreme views. Because there are people in our Sangha now, meaning the Sangha is the word for a spiritual community. And there are people in our spiritual community who I'm not even on speaking terms with at the moment because we had some disagreement and we couldn't come to an understanding. And, I recognize that definitely equally my fault, my, weakness in being able to uh, come to an understanding just as much as I can attribute it intellectually to their ignorance or their dogmatic mentality or whatever the case may be. People are coming from different places, but like I would love it if we could all start being more understanding of each other's vocabulary and being more inclusive, because it's just the divisiveness. I mean, I know I'm preaching to the choir when I'm speaking with you about this, but if anyone listens and can get any benefit from this conversation, then I'll be happy, because that's what's gonna ultimately save communities, is when people come together. But it's not happening at the moment. Like, things are getting more divided. We had this awful, awful situation in our community here in Michigan where a group of neighbors were forming a kind of community coalition against racism, and they had all these programs in place that they wanted to implement. So they were raising money, and they did like a email, thing to try to collect funds so they could do all these anti-racism programs. And it's really great. I mean, I'm fully supportive of what they're trying to do. But an unfortunate thing happened where some of the volunteers for this organization got into a huge feud with their neighbor and started accusing that person, the neighbor, of being this racist. And like, it turned into this big thing that it never needed to be. And from our perspective, it was like in total contradiction to what they're trying to do by creating inclusivity, bringing the community together, educating people. But what ended up happening was more prejudice, more bigotry, more fighting. And, I don't want to share the details of this negative interaction, but it happened just down the road from us. And so it made a big impression on me. And I'm also close with both parties. So it was just so sad for me to see how people who had been friends and neighbors and very close for 20 years, like, I mean, people who had supported each other in like deaths of their loved ones, and now they don't even want to see each other on the road because of some awful misunderstanding about this program they were trying to start in their community. So I would say, to try to sum up, my answer to your question is, let's all lose the intellectual ego. Let's be vulnerable enough, which is also strong enough, to step forward, to come to the middle a bit and hear each other out. And of course we can correct each other. Of course we can call each other out on our, biases and prejudices and wrong views. But it gets so tricky, because when we start forming judgments about what other people think and act, then we're basically risking doing the same thing that we're accusing them of doing. And then it just becomes this tit for tat, and then you have the Capulets and the Montagues.
Mm.
like in Romeo and Juliet, where people don't even remember why they're fighting in the first place. They just know they're against those other people.
Right. That's so fabulous in describing the polarization that we've been seeing building all year. And I think that part of almost like beginning in neutrality is to find what is it that I'm really trying to achieve by providing information. What is it that I know is our common goal? And I just sent out an email this morning on my mother's behalf, who she is in Florida and she's absolutely refusing to receive the injection. And she wants to convince her relatives that this is very dangerous and that there's no evidence for it and so forth. And she gets into like almost a hyper state of anxiety of needing to convince them. So what I did with Mom is I said, Mom, come to a place of, first of all, knowing what it is that you want is probably what they also want, which is to be healthy. Start with that, is that you want to be healthy, I want to be healthy. Can we like stand in a place of neutrality and be curious about looking at all different pieces of evidence of the one goal that we have, which is to be healthy? And then from that point, I also encouraged Mom to realize that it's very likely still, even with all the evidence and the one common goal of let's be sure that what we want for everyone is to be healthy, is that some people will be choosing not to be healthy and to, in fact, take something that could cause an autoimmune disease or to die. So then I had to have Mom face her death. And her death is actually the fear that the ones that she loves are going to die. So facing her own mortality is where I got Mom to this kind of also neutral void space of realizing there will be people who are doing whatever they're doing to, die when they need to die. And my mom from that space faced her own fear of death and said, well, I know I'm this age, I'm advanced in my years and I'm going to die anyways, but I'm going to die without choosing something that is like given to me out of fear. So what I brought my mom to was almost like this void space of, Mom, first face your death. And there's something really necessary in everybody's debate right now is to realize that what we're all trying to avoid is our death. Even though we might call it, what I'm giving you this information about is to be healthy. Those are the two poles. So what I want to encourage people to realize is there might be more like chaos as this comes down. And my brother is saying, well, I'm not going to take this unless they threaten my job. And then if they threaten my job, so and on, it's going to potentially get really crazy out there. And then that's when I have to really come back to the center and be like in this free will position of, gosh, yeah, people are going to die. People are going to choose. People are going to choose death. People are going to choose autoimmune diseases and inflammatory responses, and that will be their journey. And so to be in a neutral space is to face my own death. I feel like that is the ultimate void place to come from, is I'm trying to convince everyone because I don't want them to die. But really, I just have to face my own death. I'm going to die. It's a very interesting, like lack of curiosity around mortality that I also think keeps us in this ego inflation. Is like, this mortal body is going to die. Maybe we're facing a mass extinction. Of course we are. And that's where I settle all the time, actually, is with my curiosity about death.
Well, death is the ultimate yoga. And that's, that's a topic that I think many people aren't able to approach, and I don't expect them to. And that way, I do recognize myself, my wife, and, the few of us who are, ordained and deeply committed to the Tantric Buddhist lineage that we're a part of. For us, facing death is basically the ultimate goal, you could say, of our practice, though it's not really an objective goal. It's a goalless goal, but in the approach stage, it seems like a goal, right? Because prior to fully realizing the reality of human life, we're still locked into this duality. We have our, there's the duality in the earth element between our inner, like what's going on inside our body and what's going on outside our body. We have the duality of our feelings and emotions, where we have this sense of our personal feelings as separate from other people's personal feelings. And then through empathy, we start to understand the energetic connections that we share. But then, when we come to the mental and perceptual plane, there's the duality of the expansion of consciousness, the oneness, that feeling of oneness that pervades the universe, but then also this, the stark individuality of our experience. And then on an even finer level, intellectually, there's the judgment of who am I? What am I? Like, what is this witnessing? What is this consciousness that's witnessing life? That duality that we have to come to terms with is on the plane of quantum physics. That are we witnessing something separate from our ability to witness it? And then we haven't even gotten to death of the soul or death of the ego, and transcending altogether any sense of that I am a unique and special something in this world. So, I mean, to get to that place of accepting death and contemplating death and meditating on death and ultimately experiencing death in this lifetime in order to come back with compassion to help people. For someone like me, what I just said is even still remains as a kind of conception, because I haven't gone so deeply into that and returned enough times to even really be able to, know what I'm talking about. So, it's tough because I've been fortunate enough to be exposed to the teachings and had the gall and the willpower to dedicate myself to that. But I don't expect that from most people. And I'm not saying that I'm like better or special or anything. It's just a choice that I've made, that I want to go there in my psyche. But I totally get, and I'm fully sympathetic that for most people, that's just way beyond where they're willing to go in their mind. So I've learned not to push the envelope. I mean, Lalita, when I first got involved and deep into our meditation practice, and you remember us, and we came back from India wearing robes. We were wearing our Buddhist robes, and we looked so eccentric. And our family were like, oh, wow. Wow, okay. And I mean, I would go off on these eccentric diatribes with people talking about these philosophies, and I was barely even purified in my own emotions, you know. I mean, I was like very much at that time talking out my ass. I believed all of it fully, but wow, people must have really thought I was off my rocker. And, you know, like I probably burned some bridges during that time before I, you know, got mature and figured it out that I didn't have to inform everyone I met about the deepest esoteric secrets of our lineage, which I shouldn't have been doing anyway. But you know, it was that was part of my journey, was to understand the importance of not talking, also as much as, you know, the importance of sharing my experiences. So, you know, just to bring it back to your main point about the challenge in waking people up in this time, I think it's, you know, it's coming to a place where we can offer the information and we can be totally open with the people we care about what concerns us, and you know, we can share all the knowledge we have, like I said, but ultimately some of our loved ones aren't going to be ready to accept some of these hard truths. And so they'll either learn from suffering and get woken up in the process of upheaval, or they'll perish. Mm-hmm. And it's going to be very sad. You know, I don't know what to say. Of course, I'm not wishing that on anyone, but at this point, things are accelerating. It just feels like we also need to sort of start battening the hatches in our, you know, personal lives, and get ready for what's coming, whatever it ends up being. That's my opinion, at least.
John, that's such great advice. I'm going to start to close now because we're nearing on 2 hours, but there was this whole piece that I wanted to speak to John around Aquarius, because if I may speak about that, John's sun is in Aquarius, so he's going to receive the application of some of the most like primary astrology that is coming this year, with Saturn and Jupiter in Aquarius square to Uranus in Taurus. And Uranus is like the revolutionary energy of being embodied in a physical body. And Taurus is also like the sensual soil and the smell and the taste and all of those things that you saw John experiencing when he was opening those jars and telling you about how he grew things. That very much is the Uranus and Taurus. But I'm not going to go on about the astrology, but what John just said was, we're going to reach a lot of crises. I can see the squares forming of crisis this year. And people are going to choose to awaken through suffering. And this is a really wonderful opportunity to awaken through suffering, because yesterday I checked the CDC website and found that amazingly, the flu has been virtually eliminated this year. um, and someone who works for the CDC and does the calculating for that responded that, in fact, the PCR test gives any kind of indication that you may be having a respiratory illness, so that it's mostly 97% false positives, so that virtually everyone who has the flu is being counted as COVID-SARS. And pneumonia and every other respiratory illness is being counted as COVID-SARS because the tests are 97% false positives. So all of that is that. Plus, I happen to know the administrator of 10 different hospitals who was told, count them all as COVID-SARS because we get additional funding for that. So people should know that. That is like directly from my personal friends and clients. The other data that's in from the VAERS report, VAERS report, of the how the reactions are going to the shot, is that as of December 28th, there were 127 deaths from this shot.
Yikes.
Plus a whole, 521 cases of severe influenza-like illness, 57 cases of blindness, 175 cases of eye swelling, 1,117 cases of herpes developed after receiving this shot, 717 cases of headache, 1,531 cases of fatigue, 1,410 cases of amnesia, dizziness, disorientation, vertigo, confusion, and delirium. So if any of this scares you that John grows medicinal cannabis and that he's some kind of off-grid strange drug user, just know that when you go and get this shot, you are potentially going to give yourself every bit of the most life-threatening co-symptoms, plus possibly death. And learning through those kind of sufferings and death is a great soul knowledge. And so where we might have to sit is in that witness state of letting that consciousness do what that consciousness needs in this lifetime. But to me, it's all going to get very tantric soon. I mean, it's going to be we have to face both sides of the situation. So do you want to respond to that, John? Is anything still poking you that you want to say?
Not really. I mean, what you said is quite alarming, so I hope people take note of it. But I will say, I was actually curious to continue our discussion about the astrology maybe later on. Amazingly, this call got extremely long, and I apologize if anyone felt like we were rambling at any point, but if anyone's still listening, then I appreciate it, because this is my first time doing something like this in an interview format, and so it's been a great learning experience for me also to talk with you, Lalita, and I hope we get to do it again and maybe go over some of the topics that we didn't get to today, and maybe I'll get better at being more concise and condensing some of my answers so that we can cover more of a variety of topics the next time we talk.
Yeah, wonderful. So if people have questions or comments or want John and I to speak about something else, or if you have suggestions for videos, please put that in the comments when we post this. So my next thing is to see if we can get this published, because the last time I tried to publish the last Vinifera, I was knocked off several times and then logged out of my Facebook 3 times. So it is really interesting how much censoring is happening right now. So I want to thank John for also, he may not realize how brave he is to talk to me. So thanks, John. All right, bye-bye for now.